Joining you from the YCT Beit Midrash in Riverdale, New York, but with you in spirit, with a lot of love for the West Hartford Jewish community, for Beth David, and especially for Rabbi and Leslie Adler and family. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to spend a Seder with a Persian Jewish family in the Boston area. And as we were celebrating in the middle of Magid, they had moved from the dining room table to the living room. We're all sitting out on couches very comfortably, telling the story of the Seder of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus, when all of a sudden, the mother turns to the children and says, "Where are you now?" And they say, "We're in Egypt." "And where are you going?" she said. "We're going to Eretz Yisrael." The family did this and a number of other customs that reenacted a sense of the Exodus as a live event in this family's lives. Not something which we're talking about that happened thousands of years ago, but something which we're experiencing today. Maimonides, Rambam, famously says, while we speak about the idea of B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo kilu hu yatsa mitzrayim, we're supposed to see ourselves personally as having been part of the Exodus. Maimonides changes the language of lirot, to see, to the language of leharot, to show, to portray. And this family, through what they were doing, were reenacting the Exodus in a way that allowed for their children to have a sense that they were part of something powerful that was going on. I think about this idea of children. I'm 40 years old, and I remember having Sedarim with my grandparents. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor from Krakow in Poland, went through a very difficult time during the Shoah, during the war in the various camps that he was in, lost his family, and knowing that I was his first grandchild was sort of this thing that I had as a young child, and something that I continue in my life, as I've now inherited some of the pictures from our family that we have from before the war, ritual objects. We have a Megillat Esther that we use on Purim from my grandmother's family. What does it mean to be the bridge, the one who takes those objects, that legacy of the generations that were, and now have my own young children, 6.5, 4.5, 1.5 years old, named for those very people? How do I now bring a legacy to them? Leharot, to show that it's not just something of the past, but something that we still continue to feel today. Whether that's a sense of a legacy of the Shoah, of the fact that, yes, many of our people were killed, but also our people survived. They came, they flourished here in America. We've built Medinat Yisrael. There's so much that we have accomplished, and that's a story that we want to tell here too. And so I encourage us, as we think about Passover, not just as an event of thousands of years ago, but as the event of leharot, of seeing ourselves, feeling ourselves, experiencing for ourselves through the food, through the discussion, through the actions, perhaps through the songs or the other ways in which we as individual families have customs that reenact episodes of the past and create personal, meaningful experiences for our families in the present. How do we then keep those going for the future? What are the stories that we want to tell the other people around the Seder table? What are the stories we want to tell our family members? Maybe we can't be together with the same people because of the pandemic. So, okay, who do we reach out to before the Seder? Who do we call on the phone and say, there's the story I want to tell you about your grandfather. The story I want to tell you about how we do something very special at our Seder. This is the tune that we always used to use for Manish Tana, because that's the way that we do it in our family. This is our family's story. And in so doing, Chag HaPesach becomes an opportunity for growing, for doing, for connecting, and ultimately for experiencing a sense of Geula, of freedom, of truth, and of true joy, of connecting with so many generations, past, present, and future. Chag Kasher V'Sameach.
When it comes to the Passover Seder, one of the more memorable, salient aspects are the 4 cups. Now, these 4 cups of wine, as mentioned in the Mishnah, a foundational rabbinic document of rabbinic literature, mandates the very bare minimum of 4 cups of wine at the Passover Seder, that even a poor person who is funded, who is provided with material goods and foods from even the public funds, is given the very bare minimum for enough wine for 4 glasses of wine. And if that's what we're providing on the broad scale for the poor, imagine for those of us who are not in such socioeconomic status. So this very floor of 4 is really fascinating. Now 4, as it turns out, is a very common number in earlier rabbinic literature, in the Mishnah. And for our sages, 4 actually works really well because it works off of a 2x2 sort of matrix structure. And it works out really well, as it turns out, for the Passover Seder. We get 2 glasses of wine prior to the meal, and then we get 2 cups post-meal. Now this works out, and we kick things off with Kiddush. This is very normal. We do this for other holidays. We do this for Shabbat year-round. This is perhaps the most normal thing of the entire Passover Seder. We're having Kiddush. And as we'll see, the Seder night actually is meant to provoke a lot of questioning, but we're starting off in a very normal way. Jumping ahead to the 3rd cup, we get to the Birchat Hamazon, the grace after meals. Just as we kicked off the meal with Kiddush, we're now closing out the meal with Birchat Hamazon and another cup. This is not the most strange thing, not the most unusual thing. It's part of our practice, and even to this day, there are some who close out their meals with a glass of wine. Lovely. Okay, we have the 1st cup, we have the 3rd cup. What about these 2nd and 4th cups? What is going on with them? There is a saying in the Babylonian Talmud by Rabbi Yonah that says, "In omrim shira ela hayayin," that we don't sing song except upon wine. Very fitting for this 4th cup of wine. Hallel is songs, right? It's a collection of psalms, Tehillim, that we sing. Well, what better way to enjoy this singing of psalms than over a glass of wine? This is some brilliance in the minds of our sages to mandate this 4th glass of wine at this time as we sing these psalms. Very lovely. And also, having had at least 3, if not more, glasses of wine throughout the course of the meal, closing it out with this 4th one is a lovely, almost of a dessert of sorts, of wine. This 2nd glass, though, is really quite curious, right? If we want to talk about the Seder night in general as meant to provoke questions, certainly Magid, the storytelling aspect, where we're really meant to inquire and ask about the story of the departure from Egypt, well, certainly, I think out of the 4 glasses of wine, this one certainly is the one that really puts on an alert for asking questions. So why do we have a glass of wine at this 2nd cup, at this time of Magid? I'm going to offer something. I did not see this in the Talmud, but what fascinates me about this is that it really concretizes Magid. That just as much as we see for both Kiddush and Birchat Hamazon, that it concretizes and that it provides there's a lived experience more than just words, that having and ingesting this wine is a way to really give a real feel, a real body, a substance to what we're doing with the Magid, with the telling of the recounting of the departure of Egypt. I think also what it does is it's not just meant to be words, it's meant to be an enjoyable experience, that the wine helps lubricate this experience and make it certainly enjoyable and certainly something to sit around and really recount with joy. And that ultimately, I think, pulling back from the 4 cups, that's what this evening is about. Really night. We're not really talking evening. This is a nighttime activity, the Passover Seder. It's this opportunity to really engage in song, right? I think if we want to take Rabbi Yonatan's statement and broaden it out, this whole evening is about song and singing. And so if joy is involved, we are really rejoicing over the departure of Egypt, our ancestors really forming a nation. And I want to wish you a happy Passover and L'chaim.
It has been a great 3 years since we left West Hartford, and we continue to miss it. Our children, Eliana, Zev, and Adira, talk about West Hartford nearly every day. Not so much Adira, who's now 4 years old, but we certainly miss it. We, of course, turn our attention now to Pesach. As we go into this moment, we hear the rising need to purchase matzah from all its sources. And of course, the matzah, the central part of the message, is the lechem ani, eating the bread of the ani, the poor person. And as we eat it, we are thinking about all of the affliction, all of the pain, all of the process, not only of our time in Egypt, but also of our many trials and tribulations in our Jewish narrative. and perhaps our many narratives in our shared cultures of times of oppression, times of poverty, and times when we did not have enough. Although many of us have full bellies, we continue to want more, we continue to starve for more things, and we continue to ask God for what we need, and that's within our rights, within what is expected of us. On the other hand, the Gemara in Pesachim, Kuf Tet Vav, talks about another version of what these words mean. Lechem Ani is not only the bread of affliction, but a drasha that is made from these words is that this bread is also Lechem Oni, the bread of song. The bread where we are singing praises, singing about our joy, singing about good times. And this is why I believe our Seder is full of paradox, full of us celebrating while also talking about the pain, full of us, our white tables and our wine and our beautiful meal as we talk about the slavery in Egypt. And in these moments, we wonder the strange mood that we're in. How could we be celebrating when we know that around us there is pain? And now we are doing our Seder for the second time in the COVID era. And we think about the strange times we've had, talking about how we've done okay, some of us, during COVID, but also knowing about the tragic losses we've had, not only in these many people that have died of COVID all over the world, but also in our own lives. While at the same time, we have found ways to connect more with those most close to us. And we have connected more physically. Perhaps we have found more time to call each other, to create moments weekly, daily, monthly over Zoom. How these times have given us the good with the bad as well. And this, of course, is the human experience. Even in our most difficult times, we not only search out joy, but joy comes to us. And we often feel uncomfortable. Who hasn't laughed at a funeral or cried at a wedding? We are complicated people living in complicated times. And we only have the message throughout this to search for knowing ourselves at any one time, knowing in this moment who we are, knowing that this joy can turn to happiness, this happiness can turn to anxiety, this sadness can turn to frustration, and the frustration can turn back to serenity. This is a time when we can have different emotions. We merely have to be honest with that and connect to it in order to really sharpen who we are and sharpen what is going on right now in order to see what needs we have at that time. And what is the answer? Where are we all going through this? The end of the Seder is not an idea that everything will be okay. It's an idea that we will return to this place of Jerusalem, return to a place where we can know that our prayers are being accepted. We return to the place of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. That wherever we're going, happy and sad, it's not that we're going to happy times. That's not the point of arriving with the third temple. The idea of going back to Jerusalem is arriving at a time when we can offer a sacrifice and know that God can take it. Know that God will lift up that sacrifice for sure. Know that God will hear our emotions, happy and sad, frustrated and angry, and God can hear them and accept them. And God can respond as God responds. So this Pesach, I wish you a Chag Sameach, a Chag Kasher Sameach, as we always do. I do wish this is a joyous time, but I also urge this to be a time of truth, a time of knowing how you're feeling at any one moment, and not to feel a need to feel sad or a need to feel happy, but merely a need to be honest and to know that God is there ready to hear that emotion and to respond accordingly. Chag Kasher Sameach from Rockville, Maryland.
Hello, West Hartford. My name is Saul Strosberg, And I was the very first intern at your shul about 16 years ago when Rabbi Adler took a huge chance on a brand new rabbinical school, inviting me into the community to show me your lovely ways and the important work that he does. So I've been serving at Sherith Israel in Nashville, Tennessee for 15 or 16 years, and I'm loving the work that I do and think fondly back to my first days in West Hartford 16 years ago. And I want to share with you one of my favorite messages from the Haggadah. It's a paragraph that comes right after the four sons, and the paragraph reads in Hebrew, Yachol merosh chodesh, Talmud lomar bayom hahu. Perhaps they should have begun celebrating Passover from Rosh Chodesh, from the beginning of the month. And the paragraph ends, it says, no, bayom hahu. The answer is, we celebrate Passover, the Leil HaSeder, that night, from the time that we have the matzah and the maror on our plates. The question's really about when Passover begins, but throughout the Haggadah, the question is asked, when does the Pesach story really begin? Does the Pesach story begin when Pharaoh took away their straw? Does the Passover story begin when Joseph went down to Egypt? Does the Passover story begin in the times of Abraham, when God told Abraham that 3 to 4 generations would become strangers in a strange land? When does the story really begin? And by the same token, we ask the question, when does the story end? When does the Passover story end? Does it end at the splitting of the sea? Does it end at Mount Sinai? Does it end at the reconquering of the Promised Land? Does it end at the beginning of the temple? Has the Passover story even ended? And I think the challenge for all of us who want to see Pesach night as a transformative night of the year and of our lives is to think about, where did our Jewish journey begin? Where did my story start? Did it begin when I was born? Did it begin when my grandparents or great-grandparents emigrated to America? When did my journey begin? And when and where will it end? Does my journey end at the end of my life? Does it continue on to the next generations? And those are the things I think about Pesach night. Wishing you all a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a happy and kosher Pesach.
I want to thank Rabbi Adler and the Beth David community for inviting me to share some of my Torah with you. I remember very well and very fondly the year I spent coming as an intern to your congregation. At the Seder, we will all count out plagues and drops of wine. Until recently, this has all been a bit abstract for me. When my children were young, we made a game of the plagues, throwing around plastic frogs and other toys. This year, unfortunately, we will have a new understanding of the plagues in general, and specifically the plagues of darkness and the slaying of the firstborn. Given our newfound insights into the experience of the suffering of the Egyptians, what new understanding can we bring to our Seders? To find meaning in such pain is a tall order, as it is to reinterpret the story of the Exodus, one that we know so well. Yet, on the other hand, the Haggadah tells us that in every generation we have to see ourselves as coming out of Egypt. How do we do that this year? We are told that the plagues of darkness forced the Egyptians to stay home, an experience we can all relate to well now. They could barely move. Rashi said the darkness of night became even more black and dark. The darkness was palpable. Ramban describes it as a fog from the sea that even a candle could not illuminate. The Egyptians were isolated and scared, like many of us this year. Similarly, the plague of the slaying of the firstborn touched every family, from the poorest to the royal house of Pharaoh. At the burning bush, God had referred to Bnei Israel as God's firstborn, and in Egypt spared the Jewish people. Unfortunately, this year, all too many of us have been touched by our plague. In the midst of the final plague, God commands Moshe to tell people to get ready to leave Egypt. The Torah commands us, Ushmartem et hadavar hazeh, lechok lecha uvanecha ad olam. You shall observe this as an institution for all time, for you and your descendants. The Jewish people have observed Pesach for 3,000 years, through easy times and challenging ones. Like last year, for many of us, this Pesach will be celebrated with challenges. But we are not the first Jews to have seders amidst the dark times. Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, a 15th century nobleman and Torah scholar, was forced to flee from Portugal, Spain, and then Italy. He used his experience to renew his understanding of the Pesach story. In his introduction to the Haggadah, he wrote that the poverty of my exile surrounds me and I will encircle it with the wheels of redemption and miracles, including commentaries and requirements and purposes, new and respected, which do not discredit the first ones, which were sweeter than honey and the drippings of honeycomb. How will we encircle this year? In a very Jewish way. We will talk about it. The Talmud tells us that the matzah is the bread upon which we will answer many questions. In fact, even if we are celebrating alone, we still ask ourselves the 4 questions. We will carry on the tradition for ourselves and for future generations. The Torah tells us, L'man tesaper b'oznei banecha uven banecha, that you should recount in the hearing of your children and your children's children. What will we tell the next generation about this year? How will we tell them the story of our time in Egypt and our redemption? We will start with the matzah and the invitation it brings to tell our stories, and hope that even if we are still slaves this year, next year we will be free. It may still be too soon to know how we will ultimately recount this story. We are still in the midst of an experience and can only tell the story in the present tense. The Exodus teaches us to experience redemption both in the past tense and in the present tense. We will tell our children that we too were redeemed from our own Egypt. Hope you all have a sweet and wonderful Pesach. Take care. Be safe. Bye-bye.
Hello, Beth David community. Thank you, Rabbi Adler, for inviting me to share some Torah with you all in preparation for Pesach, and thank you to everybody for the wonderful 2 years that I spent learning with you and celebrating Shabbat and holidays with you in West Hartford. So let's talk about basic topic, chametz and matzah. What do they represent? What's the symbolism that we can associate with them as we refrain from chametz on Pesach and eat matzah instead? So typically, the most common understanding of this symbolism goes back to Rabbi Alexandri in the Talmud, who, it is reported, when he would finish davening, he would recite a post-prayer prayer, which went, Ribbon Olamim, God, Lord of the worlds, you know that we want to do your will, we want to do the right thing, but unfortunately there's a few things that get in our way. And the first thing that he says gets in our way from doing the right thing and following the will of God is se'or shabarisa, the leavening in the dough. Based on his use of this term in this prayer, he seems to be using it to refer to the things that are inside us that make us go wrong. After all, what is leavening? Leavening is fermentation. It's bubbling. It's an alien admixture into the flour and the water and the other ingredients in your bread that make it puff up, sour, and change into something that it wasn't before. And so therefore, it seems like he's using, and many other people since him have used, chametz, se'or, as a metaphor for the aspects of us like pride and arrogance, like selfishness, like yetzer hara, that sour us, that puff us up with hot air, that make us feel bigger and more important about ourselves, that change us into something that we weren't meant to be. In this schema, matzah, on the other hand, is simple and pure, and doesn't have that problems. And so, therefore, we switch out the chametz, we get rid of the bad qualities in ourselves, and we eat matzah on Pesach to be pure and simple and straightforward. Okay, fine. This is very common. When I was learning at Mechon Pardes in Israel after college, one of my yeshiva mates, a guy named Luke Hawley, suggested, though, a radical reinterpretation of this symbolism. He pointed out the following thing. Leavened bread is alive, like yeast is a microorganism. All the people over the course of the last year who have been experimenting with sourdough know that it's a living thing. You take care of it. You feed your sourdough starter. People treat it like a pet, like it's a real living thing. Even those of us who use yeast that you buy in the supermarket know that when you put the dried yeast into the water, it wakes up and it starts doing its thing and bubbling. So if yeast, if leavening, if se'or, if chametz is alive, we know from Bereshis that life is good. How could it be that life would represent something negative? Why should the lack of life then represent something positive? So this yeshiva mate of mine, Luke, said, we got it all wrong. Or maybe we didn't get it all wrong, but here's just another way to look at it. Life is good. Chametz is good. Matzah is also good, but it's not alive. The reason we get rid of chametz for Pesach isn't because chametz is bad. It's not because life is bad, because life is not bad. But life can be bad in certain circumstances. We're not getting rid of life in general. We're not getting rid of the microorganism. We're getting rid of the life of Egypt, the life of slavery. God tells us to get rid of the chametz and eat matzah, not because matzah is a higher level of bread, but because matzah is cleaning that life away. It's a brutal transformation. It's a death and rebirth. We go from the living bread of chametz to the dead bread of matzah in order to return afterwards to life again, life of Torah, life of Har Sinai. On Shavuos, there was a special sacrifice that was brought of the Shtei Halechem, which, unlike almost every other incident of grain in the sacrificial system, the korban of bringing the Shtei Halechem were breads of chametz. We get rid of the old life of Egypt in order to be reborn in the new life of Torah. One thing we can learn from this, besides a philosophical concept to think about chametz and matzah, is a lot of people don't really like eating matzah. We do it because we have to, but we complain about it and we dream about the cakes and the cookies and the pizza and whatever that we're going to have after Pesach. So what I'd like to suggest is that that's fine. It's okay to not like matzah. Just remember that when you're yearning for those cookies and pizza and cakes, what you're really yearning for is the new life that comes after Pesach, the new life that comes after leaving Egypt, the new life of Torah, of Am Yisrael. So everyone, have a happy Pesach and an even happier after Pesach.